The objective of the presentation that I'm going to give today is really to talk about new game development and basically the point that new game development, unlike kind of optimization, scaling, and live ops, are actually two fundamentally different disciplines that require two different sets of skills and actually a different kind of mindset in order to be successful. And then beyond that, what I want to do is to talk about some best practices or some of my own personal theories of how do you maximize the chances of success when it comes to new game development. And so I want to actually just see, in terms of the audience, how many of you are familiar with this book, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel? Okay, so a fair number of you. So one of the things that I want to do is to actually take this concept of 0 to 1 from Peter Thiel's book and then actually apply it to new game development. And so for those of you who aren't aware, let me actually explain what this concept is about. And so Peter Thiel describes this concept as follows. Doing what we already know how to do takes the world from 1 to n, adding more of something familiar. But every time we create something new, we go from 0 to 1. The act of creation is singular, as is the moment of creation. Is there any way we can fix this? All right. And the result is something fresh and strange. And so, 1 to n is doing something familiar. 0 to 1 is about creation and about doing something strange. Okay, so Peter Thiel actually describes this concept graphically in terms of forms of progress. And so horizontal or extensive progress is about copying things that work. And on the y-axis, vertical or intensive progress is about doing new things. And in terms of, from a macro level, we can think about technology in terms of 0 to 1. 0 to 1 is about a new technology, discovering something new. Whereas 1 to n is about taking that technology and optimizing it, scaling it, taking it from region to region, about the globalization of that technology. And so the focus of today's discussion is really going to be about that part, the new game development. I will talk about some of my own personal theories in terms of how to maximize your chance of commercial success, and then to really focus on the differences between, again, new game development and live ops. So I want to now ask a question. Is 0 to 1 a problem? Is this a problem in new game development? And so one of the questions I would then ask is, when was the last time one of these big companies like Zynga or Glue was able to internally develop a hit new game, right? It's been about 4 or 5 years. It's been a while. And even if you consider Supercell an exception, I think you'd have to agree that there seems to be a trend. There seems to be a pattern in which large companies, for some reason, start to become bad at new game development. And so when we look at the marketplace, we see that the impact of what I'm talking about is starting to take shape in the marketplace. And so if we were to think about companies in terms of their stage of scale, early, mid, late, what we're seeing is that these larger companies like, Zynga, Glue, Playtika, have been acquiring the companies in the mid-tier. And the reason why they've been acquiring those companies is because when you look at the financials of these large companies, all of their growth has come from acquisition and rather than internal game development. So then the next question I would ask is, so what is the cost of this? What is the cost of not being able to do internal mobile game development if you're a mobile game studio? And I came up with two numbers. The first number I came up with is $35 million. And the second number I came up with is $1 billion. And, the point isn't the number, but the fact that you can make an argument that if these companies don't figure out new game development internally, that it is actually very, very costly. So, just to be clear, I'm going to bring up some examples. I'm going to talk about some companies, but I'm not doing this to denigrate anybody, right? I think that mistakes have been made in the industry. I make plenty of mistakes personally, but I just wanted to use some of the mistakes that have occurred in the industry as case studies and examples so that we, as an industry, could all get better. And so this was a game called Guardians of Haven that was launched by Gree's US office. And this is a game that was a city builder, a PvE Clash Royale, and an FPS shooter. And the game was developed for $35 million and ultimately just completely failed. And the argument I would make here is that did greed need to completely build this massive game before they realized that this is a concept that would work or not? And so the argument I make is that for a lot of companies, especially, and what we find in a lot of large companies, is that they don't have fundamentally sound pre-production practices. And so instead of taking these 3 games and stapling them together and launching it, I think there were other things that could have been done to test whether this concept would work in pre-production. And I'll talk about that later in this presentation. When we look at Glue, apologies for some of the Glue folks here in the audience, but the stock price has been sort of in a free fall, right? And the argument I make is that, there's certainly other factors at play, but one of the biggest factors has been the fact that Glue has not been able to be successful in terms of successfully commercializing a lot of their new games and the games that they have in soft launch. And so if we were to take the stock price today from 6 months ago, that difference is about $1 billion, right? And just as a specific example, I have a YouTube channel called Game Makers, and one of the games that we reviewed was one of Glue's games called Disney Sorcerer's Arena. And one of the things that we see is that when we look at this game, Disney and the Disney audience, and when we look at the gameplay in terms of having a very complicated type of gameplay, and when we look at the systems, which were heavily inspired by Marvel Contest of Champions and really developed for a pretty hardcore audience, we see that there is a fundamental mismatch between the fiction and the IP and the gameplay and the systems. And just to kind of drill down into this a little bit more, one of the tools that you can use to really get a sense of whether there is a match or not is Facebook Audience Insights. And so when we look at Facebook Audience Insights for Disney, we see that 63% of the women, at least 18 and above, are Disney fans, or typically older. And so we have what Facebook doesn't count people who are 18 and under, but certainly it's common sense that Disney has, a young kids audience, and then also an older, largely female audience. And so why is that? And in terms of the other thing that you can see is in terms of likes and affinities. And when we look at the Disney audience, what do they like? They like Baskin-Robbins. They like IKEA, Betty Crocker, Gerber, right, which is a baby foods brand in the US. And so we kind of get a sense of who that audience is. And when we look at affinities as well, again, Baskin-Robbins, Netflix, Pillsbury, Pizza Hut. So you kind of get a sense for who the audience that likes Disney is, right? But then let's look at Marvel Contest of Champions, which is what the game that was launched in soft launch was emulated after. And we see that it's kind of the complete inverse. It's 29% women, 71% men, right? Also, when we look at their likes and affinities, we see that the audience playing Marvel Contest of Champions are hardcore Marvel fans, UFC fans, EA Sports, Madden NFL, NFL Network. So that audience that plays that game is mainly male, competitive and into competitive sports, and are hardcore Marvel fans. And the affinities also shows the same type of situation. And when we look at Star Wars Galaxies of Heroes, which is the other game that this game was modeled after, we see that it's even worse. 9% women, 91% men. And that similarly, the audience there has likes and affinities that are, very focused on that Star Wars IP, right? And so it makes sense if you have a hardcore RPG that's Star Wars, people will buy those types of products, right? So the point of all of this is to say that without fundamentally sound pre-production practices, that big mistakes can occur. And that I would argue that these games, whether it's Guardians of Haven or this game, should have never gotten into production, right? That if you had a fundamentally sound pre-production practice, you could have figured out what the gameplay, what the systems are like in pre-production rather than having to actually build it. Okay, So then the question after this is, if you believe me, then how do we maximize successful outcomes? How do we try to maximize our chances of creating a commercially successful product? And, a follow-on question here is, the other thing that I often see is that, why are successful live ops teams bad at new game development? And that's an argument that I'm going to make, is that just because you're very successful at live ops does not mean that you're going to be really good at new game development. And so if you believe me on this, then what I want to next talk about is what are the skills required? What skills are required for both of these disciplines if you believe me that they are actually fundamentally different? Okay, and so I make a number of claims here, and what I'd like to do is talk to you about 4 concepts and 4 best practices that I think will help you maximize your chances of having a successful outcome when it comes to new game development. And the first is just really understanding this difference, right? In terms of people that are aligned towards new game development versus live ops, understanding what skills are required, understanding how to think about those types of people. The second is this issue I've been talking about with respect to good pre-production practices. The third is this notion of iterators versus planners. And what I mean by this is that I believe that artists, creators, there's 2 fundamentally different types of artists. And if you believe me on that, then in that case, that if we have 2 different types of people, that game companies will need to take the situational context into mind in terms of supporting a production process that is aligned towards a type of person, the type of artist that you have. And finally, I think that having a huge commercial outcome also depends on this notion of knowing a secret. And I'll go into that later in this presentation as well. Okay, so I wanted to now talk about this concept of new game development and live ops in the context of local versus global maxima. So I'm pretty sure that, many of you are probably familiar with this concept, but the way that I view, one other way to view this difference is through this notion of primitive job functions, where new game development is about finding new big global maxima, right? So that's very aligned with the job of a hunter. You're seeking these big new areas of opportunity as far as design is concerned, whereas scaling and optimization and live ops really aligns more with this notion of being a gatherer, right? You're trying to make your way up a specific maxima. It's not about finding the biggest maxima. And so that is, I think, the crux of the difference between these 2 different types. And, sometimes it could take a long time to find this global maxima. And, Fortnite is a really good example, right? So Epic had supported Fortnite for 6 years, and the game was going nowhere for 6 years. And then all of a sudden, they stumbled upon, Battle Royale and understanding how to implement cosmetics-based monetization through Battle Pass. And then all of a sudden, they found a huge new global maxima, right? And were able to significantly increase their commercial success. So now I want to talk about these differences. So I made this comparison of new game developers to hunters and to live ops types of people to gatherers. But I wanted to now talk about the differences in terms of skills, right? And so what are the skill sets that are required for each of these different disciplines? So when we think about new game development, the orientation of someone working on new games is more aligned around art, around creativity, right? Whereas in the live ops side, the orientation is more about science, it's about data, it's about analysis. In terms of focus, new game development, the focus is around this Hollywood notion of a strange attractor. How do you compel someone to come into your game? How do you attract a user? Whereas on the live ops side, it's about the familiar or what's proven. In terms of the types of analysis, sometimes in new game development, you're going to have to bet on a feeling, right? Whereas on the live ops side, it's about structure, it's about process, it's about really breaking things down into smaller and smaller components and having things very, very structured. And in terms of the type of thinking, there's a much larger discussion we can have in terms of this notion of holism versus reductionism. It's a kind of a big concept, but just high level, the type of thinking in terms of new game development, the people that work on new game development are going to have to take have a holistic picture in terms of what the game is about. They're going to have to understand the game from a very holistic perspective, whereas on the live ops side, you focus on very specific areas. And then in terms of the tools used by people in terms of new game development, it's about visualizations, it's about prototyping, whereas on the live ops side, it's about A/B testing, experiments, analysis. And in terms of certainty, with new game development, sometimes you do have to act, you have to have conviction without the data, right? But on the live ops side, as some of you at some of these more live ops oriented companies may know, like Zynga, it's like, don't talk to me without data. You don't have data, don't even talk to me, right? So it's about skepticism. You're better in live ops if you're skeptical, right? And so there is uncertainty without data. So a few key considerations, if you believe me about the stuff that I've been talking about today. First is, if I'm right, then why are successful live ops teams put in charge of new game development? If you believe me, that wouldn't happen. Secondly, many game companies continue to treat game development as a single discipline requiring the same set of skills. And so this notion of new game development and live ops is often conflated. It's put together and it's like, hey, you guys are great. Whoa. You guys are great at live ops, so why don't you go make our hit new game? And then people kind of, are confounded about when it doesn't work out. And so the other aspect of this is that I think a lot of game companies, especially game executives, really don't even know how to evaluate the talent, right? And so when you think about an executive at a large company, they think in terms of, they're much more aligned with the type of thinking around live ops. And so when you ask someone to evaluate a creative, how do they even know how to evaluate someone where, the focus that they have is more around art rather than science, right? And then the last thing I want to point out is oftentimes there's a problem with creators and artists even speaking to the people who greenlight these projects because, a lot of executives talk and think in terms of business plans, in terms of finance, in terms of, very specific types of terms and terminology, whereas creatives don't speak that same language. And so when a creative tries to explain to the executives that are greenlighting these projects, there can often be a language barrier. So I wanted to talk about this language barrier. We have a video. Can we show that video, please?
Men in Black. The Wachowskis, they came in and it was like they had only done one movie. They did a movie, I think it was called Bound. And they came in and they made a pitch for The Matrix.
And as it turns out, they're geniuses. But there's a fine line in a pitch meeting between genius and what I experienced in the meeting.
So this is the actual pitch that they made for The Matrix.
Dude, we're thinking like imagine you're in a fight and then you're like, jump. Imagine if you could stop jumping in the middle of the jump. Say that again? But then people could see around you 360 while you're jumping, while you're stop jumping, right? And then we're gonna invent these cameras and then people can see the whole jump while you stop in the middle of the jump.
So I made Wild Wild West. I'm not proud of it.
Like, you see people, that Monday I was walking around, hey guys, sorry. Hey, listen, I'm working on Bad Boys 2. Don't worry about it, sorry.
But it ain't like it would have been that, like Keanu was perfect. Lawrence Fishburne was.
Yeah, so as you can see, when the Wachowskis were pitching Will Smith on the role of Neo in The Matrix, the way that they described the movie and the role was very visual, right? And so I just wanted to underscore this point about creatives talking to executives because it's actually even worse in that case, right? And so that's the other problem is the creatives actually being able to talk in a way, in a language that executives can actually understand. Okay, so the next part I want to talk about, so we talked about this difference between new game development versus live ops, and now I want to talk about my opinion in terms of what constitutes a fundamentally sound pre-production practice. And so maybe we could first start by talking about what I believe are some of the biggest mistakes. The first big mistake is just shortcutting pre-production altogether. And this happens very often at large companies because oftentimes what happens is that the way that games are greenlit is based upon revenue targets, right? And so it's like, okay, we need to make this much revenue. Let's work backwards to when we need to launch the game. And sometimes there are delays and it's like, okay, we don't have the pre-production done, but let's just go. And so a soft launch that was supposed to take 8 months might go to 4 months, might go to 3 months. And pre-production may just completely be skipped because there's just not enough time, right? And so having worked at a number of large companies before, I can tell you this happens over and over and over again. You know, it's like, I think we've seen this movie before, but it continues to happen over and over again. The second problem is really about overstaffing, right? And so if you're doing pre-production, why do you need a big team? In fact, you really only need 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And the problem that happens when you have too many people in pre-production is that, one, there's significant communication overhead, right? You've got to talk, you've got to collaborate with a lot of different people. And on top of that, there is a pressure that comes from cost. And so if you have 19, 20, 30, 40 people, then every month that you're burning in pre-production, there's this pressure. We're burning all this money. Let's hurry up. Let's get out of pre-production. Let's just start on production, right? And so overstaffing can often lead to bad situations because of those two issues. And finally, it's about having the wrong objectives, right? And so the objectives for pre-production, I'll get into, but oftentimes for many companies, it's like, okay, pre-production is about what's the idea? What are we going to work on? High-level idea, got it, okay, let's go. Or it's about just documentation. Okay, let's document where's the game design doc, right? And that, what I'm arguing, is the completely wrong thing to do. And so from my perspective, good pre-production objectives, in my opinion, are these 3 things. The first is an understanding of key risks, right? And the deliverables against key risks is something that I call a key risk table, which I'll talk about, and then creating prototypes against each of your key risks. The second objective is having a clear product vision. In my opinion, you should not go into production until everyone on the team has a clear idea of what the product actually is. And so some of the deliverables that I like to see in terms of communicating this clear product vision is something that I call a key screens in terms of wireframes and flows, and only to have a playable, only if necessary. And that depends on the situational context for the specific game. And finally, having a business case. And the deliverables in this case could be some type of monetization table, like an opt-out contribution table, and a simple P&L forecast, right? And so the point is that this last objective is really understanding that you don't have to have everything figured out, but you should have an understanding of how are we going to make money in this game? Can we back out given, that CPIs are very, very expensive? Will we be able to do user acquisition for this game? And so talking about the first concept in terms of key risks, I wanted to highlight the study that was published on Gama Sutra that looked at, it was postmortems from 155 games. And they looked at these 155 games and made some recommendations based upon their analysis of these postmortems. And really the first recommendation conclusion that they make is to practice good risk management techniques, right? Which is why we focus on key risks. The second is to utilize prototypes as a method of proving features and concepts before committing them to design. And finally, third was don't be overly ambitious in your design. And so talking again about this key risk table, the objective of this is really to have an understanding of what are the top 3, 4, 5 things that can prevent this game from being successful, right? Whatever those things are. And then can we build prototypes? And what I mean by a prototype doesn't necessarily have to be code. It could be a playable. It could be a Facebook, art test. It could be a survey. It could be a lot of different, it could be a paper prototype, but there's a lot of different things that you can build prototypes against those key risks. And for those of you more interested in how I came to this conclusion, there's a really great 2006 GDC talk called Advanced Prototyping by these two guys, Chris Hecker and Chaim Gingold, which I would recommend you check out if you're more interested in this type of a process. But just as an example of a key risk table, here are some examples. So if the key risk is, can we implement the control scheme in a way that feels good for mobile devices? Well, in that case, the prototype would be, yeah, let's build a simple prototype of the control scheme on device. If the key risk is, will the art style match with the target audience and demographic? Well, you could do a Facebook ad test targeted against that specific demographic, and you could check things like CTR or CPI or having some type of survey. If the key risk is, will gotcha-based monetization mechanic work in this otherwise casual style of game? You can create user experience flows, have qualitative, focus group testing, things like that. And so really, the point is that you can come up with a number of risks. And what you want to do with each of those risks is try to understand, can we mitigate this risk? And if not, can we at least characterize the risk so that we have a better understanding of it as we continue into development? And then the second objective is around having a clear product vision, right? And so in addition to key screens, which I'll go into in a second, so one of the things that I recommend is, one, having the key screen. So all of the features in a game to be mapped out, right? So what you want to do is you want to create what all the major features have those screens. That'll give you a good sense of what the scope of is in a game. And then also in terms of the flows. So for each of the major features, flow out all of the screens. And so what that does is that gives not only the designers, the developers, the product managers, the producers, but everyone really gets a better understanding of, one, the scope of the game, and two, how the game flows and what is this game that we're all talking about, right? And again, these are just wireframes, so they should be black and white. It shouldn't be pretty, but that's in my experience, one of the best tools for conveying the scope and the vision of what the product should actually look like. So this is an example from a game I worked on in the past, but we used a website, and basically on the website we put all the key screens on. I don't have this is a very super old example in terms of flows, but it just kind of shows you the idea in terms of like all the screens and then what buttons go to where. But again, trying to understand how the game plays and understanding the scope. And here's another way that you can create a user flow, which is through something I call the big ass AI file. But it doesn't matter exactly how you do it, but that this kind of a tool and this kind of an understanding from the whole team is there before you start production. And then the final thing I talked about is a business case, right? And so one of the things I like to see is a monetization table, which is something I've talked about before. And so whether you do it based upon ARPDAO contribution, which is basically saying that, okay, if to hit my LTV, if I need to hit 35 cents in ARPDAO, what is the contribution from the various sources of monetization in the game? Now, you could do it against ARPDAO, you can do it against LTV. It doesn't matter the very specific way you do it, but that you have thought through this, and this isn't going to be exact, right? And so when you launch the game, some things may be off, but at least on a high level that yes, yes, we can make our money back. Yes, we can monetize to a degree that will allow us to be successful or not. And then some of the other things I like to do, for example, if you're working with IP, use Google Trends to just kind of understand, the relative potential to drive organic installs. And so here you can see that one of the surprising things that I looked at when we worked on a WWE game was that, in fact, the popularity of WWE in some of the key markets that we were looking at, mainly like Western markets, was actually very high. And then you can also just build a simple economic model in terms of, when you're comparing the game you're trying to make, you can use comps and look at downloads, revenue per download. And then you can build like a, very simple sort of, do a very simple type of sensitivity analysis. So the point here being that, it doesn't, I'm not really talking about the very specific way you do things, but that there are, very specific things you can do to help characterize what are the key risks. Can we overcome those key risks? Does everyone have a clear vision in terms of what the product is before we go into production? And finally, do we have a business case here? Can we make money, right? Okay. The third concept I want to talk about is this notion of iterators versus planners. And again, I think the point that I want to make here, and we'll go into it in a second, is that I think it's critically important to understand, to take your situational context into mind. That people are different, that situations can be different, but if we treat all situations the same, it's going to lead to suboptimal results, right? So let me talk about these two different kinds of artists. And maybe just a show of hands, but is anyone familiar with this book, Old Masters and Young Geniuses? Wow, okay, I'm impressed. Usually no one is familiar with this book, but David Gallinson in this book talks about two kinds of artists, right? And the first artist he calls experimental innovators. I call them iterators, but this type of artists are artists where their goals are imprecise, their procedures are incremental and experimental, and they repeat themselves, gradually changing in a process of trial and error. And this differs from conceptual innovators, which I simplified just by calling them planners. And these type of artists are motivated by a desire to communicate a specific idea or emotion. Their goal can be stated precisely before production, and often for these type of artists, it involves detailed preparatory work before execution. And so the archetypal types of artists for experimental and conceptual innovation are Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these two artists, but I can talk to you about the way that they painted their art, right? And so Paul Cézanne, when he was drawing, his art, he would paint a picture. And then he would throw it out. Then he would paint another picture, the same picture with a very small change, and he would throw it out. Then he would draw another picture and throw it out. And he repeated this process until he discovered the painting that he wanted to make. Now, this differs very significantly from Pablo Picasso. Now, when Picasso was drawing a painting, before he even picked up a paintbrush, he took very detailed notes. So in some cases, he made up to 300 diagrams in his notebook, and then he painted his picture, right? And so, as you can see, this really aligns with this description of experimental and conceptual innovation. Just as another example, Michelangelo, one of the famous quotes from him when he was carving David was, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." So Michelangelo was not trying to discover his art. He had a very specific image in mind. He knew what he was trying to create, and he was manifesting what he had in his mind in the physical world, right? And so the next step in terms of the logic that I wanted to present you with is that, it's not just painting. It's for all types of art. And so even when we look at things like writing books, right? And so for those of you who know about authors, there are also two very specific types of authors, right? There are discovery writers who are authors that will write their book, and they'll kind of discover the story as they'll write. And then there are the second type of writer, which is called an outliner. And they will actually outline all of the things that will happen in their book and then start to write, right? And the argument I'm going to now make with you is that this not only applies to painting, it doesn't apply to writing, it also applies to game design and development. And so two good examples of this are Game of War as an example of the planner type, or conceptual innovation. And so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with MZ, but they have a concept that if any game designer were to be hit by a bus, that business should be able to go on. And so the type of documentation, the type of planning that they have is very meticulous, is very detailed, right? Whereas if we look at a game like Plants vs. Zombies, and I had, the opportunity to meet the two guys that made this game, and I asked them, so when you made Plants vs. Zombies, how did you actually make the game? What was the development process like? And the way they described it to me was as follows. They're like, well, we kind of wrote some code, kind of came up with something. Then we refactored the code and kind of changed it. And then we kind of changed it, and we kind of refactored the code and changed it. And we kept going until we had Plants vs. Zombies. So as you can see, these two differing types of game development, right, really aligns with, again, these two fundamental types of artists. And so if you believe me there, I think the next line of thinking that I would submit to you is that there are three types of gameplay when it comes to mobile games. And that if you think about it, each of these gameplay types actually aligns with a specific type of artist, right? And so gameplay, right? That's like how you play the game. And I think it's kind of more the general case. It's not always, it's more of the general rule, but I would say that aligns more strongly with iteration-based design. Whereas systems design, which is about the meta, and social design, which is around some of the emotional mechanics that you can integrate into a game, these two types of design are more aligned with planning-based design, right? And then if you follow my thinking even further, I would say that one of the ways you can think about the opportunity in the mobile gaming space today is to say, well, look, so far we've had gameplay-focused games like Subway Surfers, right? So for all intents and purposes, Subway Surfers does not have a meta, it does not have social design. It's really just about the core gameplay. A game like Adventure Communist is all about the systems, right? It's kind of like a spreadsheet, essentially, right? I mean, there are some aspects to it, but the core is there. And then we've had games that kind of combine two types of gameplay, whether it's like Heroes Charge, which has now been copied a lot, Clash Royale, which had a lot of innovations in terms of not only the gameplay, but in terms of the meta design. And then Fortnite as well, right? And so I think one of the things that we'll see is that, this new trend in terms of auto chess, teamfight tactics. And right now, it's all about the gameplay. But I think what we'll see is that there's going to be an opportunity for someone to not just optimize the gameplay, but optimize the gameplay and the monetization, because right now, there's very little to no monetization in these auto chess types of games. And so the winner in this space is going to be the company that kind of figures out the system side to this kind of game. And then the other opportunity I see in the future is that since Game of War, there has not been a game that I think that really integrates systems-based and social-based design in a strong way. And the point I'm making here is that because these types of gameplay, or these types of design types align more strongly with a different type of person, you might actually have to bring multiple people in to optimize the overall game design. So just in conclusion, in terms of the section, one of the points that I want to make is that, again, in many companies, regardless of the type of artist that you are, regardless of the type of creator, the system, the process, when you look at like an EA with their 6x6 model, right? Or these other companies that have a very structured process, you might want to consider that you should take into account the type of artist when you're developing your structure in the process for new game development. And the final thing I wanted to talk about in this section is really this notion that Jeff Bezos talked about. There's a pretty famous shareholder note called the Day One Shareholder Note, and he talks about this concept of process as proxy. And I just wanted to read it to you because I think it's a very important concept, and a concept that I have found, especially in large organizations, is not followed, right? And so these large companies make this mistake over and over and over again, and I personally would love to see for this not to happen anymore. But let me just read this to you. So as companies get larger and more complex, there's a tendency to manage to proxies. This comes in many shapes and sizes, and it's dangerous, subtle, and very day two. A common example is process as proxy. Good process serves you so you can serve customers, But if you're not watchful, the process can become the thing. This can happen very easily in large organizations. The process becomes the proxy for the result you want. You stop looking at outcomes and just make sure you're doing the process right. It's not that rare to hear a junior leader defend a bad outcome with something like, well, we followed the process. A more experienced leader will use it as an opportunity to investigate and improve the process. The process is not the thing. It's always worth asking, do we own the process or does the process own us, right? Okay, so now I want to conclude with this last concept about knowing a secret. So what do I mean by this? So Peter Thiel in his book also states, every great business is built around a secret that's hidden from the outside. And he talks about this framework around different types of ideas. There are conventions. And conventions are very easy to understand, right? And so, in a free-to-play game example might be, well, match 3 is the biggest and highest growth genre, right? That's kind of conventional thinking. But a secret is hard. A secret is a truth that's hard to understand, hard to grasp. And so an example of this is cosmetics-based monetization can work in a Western free-to-play game. That's a secret that the guys that worked on Fortnite had that was, at that time, very difficult to understand. And so that was a secret that a lot of people didn't believe in, right? And certainly there was cosmetics-based monetization in Japan, but it's never been done at scale in a big way in the West. And finally, mysteries are things that are just kind of impossible to understand. But I won't go into that. And the other way that this concept has been described is there's a venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz by the name of Andrew Chen. And he talks about this idea that he called the dumb idea paradox. And what that means is if you have an idea that sounds smart but has no traction, well, that's just kind of dumb. If you have, if you have no traction, it's like a totally stupid idea. That's totally dumb. If it sounds smart but has no traction, then it's kind of questionable, whatever. If it sounds smart and has traction, well, then that's, great. But the biggest opportunities come when you have an idea that sounds completely ridiculous, that sounds stupid, but gains a lot of traction, right? Because then nobody else is following you. Nobody else is trying to work on that problem. And examples of this are, we talked about cosmetics-based monetization in Fortnite, but, like who would have believed in, eBay early in the days that you can just sell something and trust people? Or Uber, you're going to get into a car with a stranger and they're going to take you around, right? And so like some of the so-called dumbest ideas are the ones that will have the potentially biggest commercial outcome. And then the question that we can ask after this, though, is then, why do so few game companies look for or work on games based on secrets? And part of this, and this is the Unabomber, but the Unabomber had a manifesto. And in his manifesto, I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but he talked about 3 types of human goals. The first were goals that can be satisfied with minimal effort, goals that can be satisfied with serious effort, and finally goals that cannot be satisfied no matter how much effort one makes. And this maps back to the Peter Thiel framework. But the point is that the Unabomber actually tried to destroy technology, right? So he was bombing scientists and professors because he felt that the world had run out of these kind of secrets, right? These hard secrets. And the point I'm trying to make is that one of the reasons why a lot of game companies may not be looking for these secrets is that it's really hard, that it takes a long time. That when you look at some of these companies like Fortnite that were working on, or like Epic that were working on Fortnite for 6 years, or Blizzard that was working on Hearthstone for 6+ years, these type of games require serious effort. So again, in terms of like, why do these companies not look for secrets in free-to-play game development? One, they're hard, require serious effort. I think it's also undercapitalized, right? A lot of venture capitalists are funding small, cost-efficient teams working on a single game. They're not wanting to fund some kind of crazy sounding secret. In terms of financial and business planning, a lot of corporate executives and these bean counter types at these large organizations, they don't want to fund you for 3 years looking for a secret, for example. And then there's just a lack of understanding that I actually think that a lot of executives of these large game companies don't really understand many of the concepts that I've been talking to you about in this presentation. So in conclusion, in summary, I believe that new game development, again, is fundamentally different from this notion, this discipline around scaling, reskinning, and optimization, this live ops, in that, if you believe me again, that these two types of disciplines should be treated very differently. Now, that's not to say that the same person can't do both, but the thinking, the skills, the mindset has to be very different. So I would submit to you that the person that's actually really great at both is actually very rare. And then finally, in terms of new game development, in order to optimize your chance for a commercially successful outcome, that I believe that these 4 concepts and best practices can help you significantly increase your chances of success. And that's it. Thank you very much. For those of you that don't know, I manage a podcast, the Deconstructor of Fun podcast. I also have a YouTube channel called Game Makers, and I would definitely appreciate any feedback or any thoughts you have. So this is like the QR code for the presentation. And so that's it.